we're in the Leprechaun Museum. We're both here now in the building. And this is located in the city centre in Dublin. And we would normally have loads of people coming through this time of the year. We'd have all the storytellers active telling stories. So at the moment, we have about 11 people working here telling stories. And the Leprechaun Museum is open 11 years now, can you believe it? And this is about mythology, folklore, and legends, and it is all through oral storytelling. And the leprechaun, for those of you who don't know, is a mythical Irish character, and he is a small man, and there's a large discrepancy about the size of him, but I always say he's about up to your knee. And he has a magical pot of gold, and he also has 3 wishes that he will grant to people. So it is a way into the other world of imagination, other world of storytelling. A lot of people around the world know leprechauns, and when they come in here, we're able to take them on a journey. And because it's a conversational process, we're able to gauge how much information people have, and then tell them stories that are appropriate to the amount of information they have, and then take them on that journey. And we do that in a kind of 45-minute to an hour context, because that's about the maximum loading you can put on someone cognitively to listen to someone talking. So that's roughly how it happens. Mark's been here for 11 years. I've been here for 11 years. And I think when we're looking at it, there's about 50 people we've had through the museum as storytellers. So we've trained up about 50 people as professional storytellers. We also run storytelling courses where we train individuals how to tell stories. And I think over the last 11 years, we've had about 800,000 people through the museum. So we've told a lot of stories to a lot of different people, to a lot of different cultures, with a lot of different language abilities. So not that we've seen everything, and I'm glad we haven't seen everything, because every day still brings things that we hadn't expected to hear, or people hear things differently. So that's roughly where we're at. I'm delighted to welcome you all here to this session, and it is a conversational session. The way we progress as storytellers or as individuals is through dialogue and asking questions and trying to understand what the other person is thinking of, what they're trying to communicate. So that's roughly where we're at. Okay, so for me, in general, oral storytelling is the top end of human interaction. It is an unmediated, there's nobody, no Facebook or Twitter or anybody else getting in the way, no publishers, no editorial. It is the individual telling the story. And that's a really, I think, really powerful thing. It's your story that you're telling, and it is embodied both within the physical essence of your being and all of your experiences too. So that is what makes every story unique and every story individual. No one is going to tell a story the same way you do. No one has lived your life. No one has experienced what you've experienced like you have. So that's what makes it crucial. Our voice is an instrument. It's simply that, an instrument, and we play it all day long. And sometimes we don't realize exactly what our voice can do for us. And one of the things we might imagine is that when we hear ourselves recorded and how our voice sounds different to us, it's just we are intimate, we are one with our voice. And what we need to think about is how we hear ourselves is the way other people hear us. So just exploring that. That brings us into the situation where what you say and what you're telling people is not often or always what they're hearing. So we have to listen for what people are hearing.
Yeah.
The story you tell may not be the one they're hearing. What they're hearing is their experiences mediated through what you're telling them. And often when we tell fairy tales, people will have different imaginations of what the characters are, how they're presented. It's very simply, if we read a book and then go to see a movie, the difference we imagine between what we think in the book and how the characters presented in the movie, that's our imagination at work, and it's our experience at work. And so being conscious of that as storytellers and watching that because when we're telling stories face to face, we get a chance to dialogue with the audience. And we always say in the museum, we can know the story is working when people are leaning in. People physically move their bodies towards you when they're feeling they want to make a connection to you. And we can see this happening in real time, and we can react to it. And we know when we're losing our audience, when they're being more interested in what we're saying, and we know where the touch points are. Has something affected someone individually? Is that something that needs to be addressed after the story is told? We also leave space in the museum for people to add their own stories. So at the tour lasts about 45 minutes. There's a 15-minute breakout at the end where people contribute their own stories or just ask questions. And it's important to have that built in to your storytelling. Often people don't feel that comfortable at the beginning to share their experiences, but as they go through the process, they become much more comfortable. Yes, so just to say that storytelling is a collaborative act. You're doing it with people. The thing to notice here is that people should really be coming away with the story they've been told, not the storyteller. So people should remember the story, not the storyteller. You're a medium for telling the story. And it is our job as storytellers to present the story we think needs to be heard and explore with people how that affected. So I think we need to make space for stories. So we need to create the space for stories to be told. So there's an intimacy that needs to be involved in that. We need to make a space. Often people would have a rug that's laid out, and that's a signifier for stories to be told. So there's a certain ritual about it. So just to build that in, if you're going to be telling stories, to create a space that feels comfortable for you particularly and your audience as well. Positioning yourself where the lighting is right, not in people's faces, just getting those elements right. Feedback is extremely important. You can't really get a sense of whether your story is working unless you're allowing space for feedback. Giving positive feedback. I think it's really important that we do add in when people are telling stories back to us, we go, I liked the way you did something. I liked the way you expressed this, or I felt. So when they're feeding back to us, we need to add that in. And I think that's enough for me at this moment in time. Mark, are you okay?
I'm always good. No, it's kind of, you're absolutely right. Like in here and it's strange. Like when you're put in front of an audience and you do get that chance to talk to them afterwards. Like telling a story from, let's say, somewhere like a stage where there's that barrier between you, and then you leave at the end, and you might come back out and do another bow. That's not the same as meeting the people afterwards and having time with them. Because when people communicate with you how they see themselves in the story. Because when we tell a story, we're the hero in that story. But depending on how you come at it, and I've heard the same story told 100 different ways from different perspectives, people will look for themselves in it. And most people want to be the hero, their best self, they'll recognize in it. But it's very easy to make, a hero of the villain just by looking at it in a different way. And you see they've done that in media now over the last while. We start looking at the story of like Cruella now. We get to learn the backstory of who Cruella the Vil is, and the same was done with Maleficent. And when we explore more into our stories and people come out and you see that they've recognized themselves in the story, that may be, like you said, Tom, that may not have been the point of the story as I was telling it, but when they recognize and they communicate it back to us, it's very powerful, And you have to, I think, giving people stories that are at their level with them, that are paced and set in a location, something people would be familiar with, is really important. Tom, when you said there about creating a space for storytelling, you have to like bait the hook a little bit as well. You have to give them a reason to approach it, And the Leprechaun has been that for what we do, because people recognize it so they can engage with you on it. So laying that out and being aware of that is really important. But it's baiting the hook, it's baiting the trap and giving them a reason to approach you and come to the space that you set up.
And the other thing I would say, everyone is a storyteller. It is the quality what that makes us human. It's that ability to communicate through a narrative. But practice will make you better. So, and you will get more comfortable. One of the things we'd say is, I don't need to believe, but I need to believe that you believe. So you need to believe in your story. When you're telling it, you're fully committed to it, and people will naturally gravitate towards that. So own it, practice it, and own it. You'll be amazed at the results that come out, and the comfort level that the people on the other side, and the trust level that builds up on that, is extraordinary, and it happens very quickly and very organic.
Yeah. Off camera, usually kind of, to get me into a headspace of telling stories, I'll have I'll have a stick or something with me that I'll have in my hand. A prop is a handy thing to have as well. But when you're telling stories to younger people, and you have that thing, whether it's a hat or a piece of material that you use as a cape, or if it's a stick that you have, if you pass that around afterwards, you can see them they act like they can feel the power of it. But it could be a spoon, the most mundane thing in the world. But when you have that thing that gets you into that headspace, you'll see that when someone else takes hold of it, they feel it's like when you hand someone, like a child, like a toy sword, suddenly they're a great warrior, But it's giving them characters that aren't too alien to them. It's about giving them a storyline that they can find a way into. And Tom, if it's okay with you, I'm going to tell a story.
Well, I think you should.
Okay. I didn't cut across to tell you. And it's one of my favorite stories, and it's very real, I know, to me and Tom, and I'll say why at the end. But it's a great story of a young man called Lusmore. Now, just so you understand, Lusmore means foxglove. And this was a very talented young man down in Tipperary. And the thing about Lusmore was he had this large lump on his back, to the point where it bent him over, and his chin was almost on his lap from the weight of it. But he didn't let it stop him at all. As slow as he could be, and as painful as it was, his fingers were very nimble, and he had great eyes, and he was an amazing basket weaver. And people would sit with him while he was making the baskets, and he'd share stories. He was a great communicator, and people were interested in watching how he worked. But he'd make these baskets, and he'd sell them locally. But to really kind of give himself, a modest living, he would set off and go to the markets. And back then, this was like 18 miles going off to the market, and it was a trek for anyone. But for Lusmore, with this lump on his back, with this appendage, he really did struggle with it. But he'd make his way to the market with a little cart, a fairly heavy load of his baskets. But the great thing was, on his way back, he usually had nothing to carry because he'd sold everything. But there was 1 year where, when he went off to market, he was really feeling the aches and the pains. And Lusmore had a great day. The only way he was carrying was the money in his pockets, But he was making his way home, and he was getting tired, and he was getting sore, and it was getting quite late. So he decided to stop and take a rest. And he took a rest at this hill, which is called Knockgrafton, Mott Bailey. At one point, there would have been a wooden castle put on this, kind of, imagine it like a big pile of sugar where the top has been flattened off, a significant looking, piece of the landscape where they built wooden castles on, which had long since fallen away. But Lusmore stopped at the hill and lay down and rested his eyes for a little while. And Lusmore nodded off. He had fallen asleep, and he awoke quite late to a noise. And when he had his wits about him, he started listening, and it was singing, and it was coming from the top of the hill, and he couldn't quite make it out. So what he did was he turned, and it was steep, and he started climbing up the hill. And as he went up, he could make out the words, and it was Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday. And of course, as he gets to the top of the hill, it dawns on him, in the grogginess of his sleep, that, well, who would be singing on the top of a hill like this? It would be the good folk, the Irish fairy folk, the wee folk are up on the top of this magical hill. But he stops, and he's listening, and he can just make out the figures in the darkness, these small little delicate figures dancing around and singing as he listened to their words, which again were Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday. Without thinking, Lusmore joined in with them. First of all, he was just humming along with them. And they paid no mind to him, until afterwards he just added in. They went Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Lusmore added in. He was probably a better singer than I am now, but he carried along and he added to them, and suddenly they turned to him and they were smiling, and he was covered by these tiny little delicate hands and that, and he felt himself being pulled down deep through the ground and into the hill. And when he hit the ground, the soft ground, with a pad, he looked and he saw all these wee folk, these Irish fairy folk just gathered around him, and he was inside the hill. And he was surrounded by treasures and smiling faces. When all of a sudden, a very obviously important one of the fairies, possibly a king, stepped forward and said, Lusmore, you joined in so perfectly with us there. It was beautiful that you felt that you could join us, and then you added to our song. You gave us a gift. We have to repay you. And he's gesturing around the room at these incredible treasures. And he said, Lusmore, you can have anything that you want. And Lusmore looks around, and yeah, he knows his life could be easier if he was to take, that pile of jewels over there, or that big ruby that's sitting over there. But he says, really, he says, what I'd love is something to ease the pain of this hump. I have a great life. I don't actually want for much, but this is a real burden for me. Is there anything you can help to manage with the pain? Well, the little man let out a big roar of laughter, and suddenly everyone started laughing along with him. And again, these wee folk kind of clambered around Lusmore with their hands all over him and pulled him out by the arms and the feet and stretched him out, and then sat him back up again. And Lusmore was amazed. The pain was gone. He felt that the weight was gone, and he reached back as he could for the first time. His arms had come around, and the hump was gone. And when he looks, he could see a bunch of them, maybe 10 or 12 of them, running off into the corner, carrying the lump from his back. And they disappeared. And the king said to him again, he said, Lusmore, thank you so much. That's your burden. That's gone from you now. Go and have a great life. And thank you so much. We'll be singing this for years to come. Long after your time is gone, we'll still be singing it. And then Lusmore felt himself being bundled again up to the top of the hill, and he rolled and he tumbled down the hill and found himself on the ground. Now, it was starting to get bright at this stage. He had no idea how long he'd been in the hill, but he made his way off home. The walk was so much easier, even though he hadn't had much sleep. The walk was so much easier. And when he strode back into his little town in the early morning, when people were getting ready and coming out of their homes and busying themselves, they couldn't believe it. They recognized him from, his face and the hat he wore with the foxglove in it, which is where he got his name from. But they couldn't believe that it was the same man. He was handsome, he was standing tall and strong, and people were rushing over to him, friends and people who sat and listened to his stories. And he told them what had happened. And they were amazed by this, but there was the proof. He was standing tall. There was a few people standing around the outskirts kind of looking at it and grumbling, You can't please everyone, of course. But Lusmore's story spread, and it spread through the town, and it spread to other towns, and it fell to the ears of a woman called Una. Now, Una wasn't the nicest woman, but she had a son. Jack Madden was the son's name, and like Lusmore, he had a lump on his back, but that was the only similarity between these two men. You see, Jack Madden was lazy and bitter, and to be honest, being raised by the type of woman he was, it was no surprise. But she started hassling her son and asking the son, how did Lusmore get rid of his lump? Is the story true? And she decided she would go see Lusmore herself. She made her way to his town, she beat on his door, and when he answered, she just strode right in past him. And as polite as he was, he gave her a cup of tea and he told her the story again. There was no thanks. There was no offer to wash her own cup. And she just strode back out of the house again, went to her son, Jack, and told him he was to go to the same hill and he was to join in with the fairies. He practically beat him out the door. He would have been happy to just stay in the house and do nothing and have food put in front of him. But she got him out of the house. He made his way. He trekked all the way to the hill. And by the time he got there, it was already night. He didn't stop for a sleep at the bottom of the hill. As soon as he could hear the singing, he just strode up the hill, dragging himself up there. Nothing subtle about it. And he didn't even wait to join in the tune. They were there Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday. And suddenly Jack Madden just goes, on Thursday, on Friday. He had an awful voice. He had worse timing, and he roared it at them. And suddenly, these wee folk turned at him and looked at him, but there were no smiles. He hadn't exactly approached them in the right way. So this time, when he felt the hands on him and himself being dragged down into the hill, he landed with a thud on a sharp stone, and he was met with these glares. And they were, Jack Madden, have you no decency about you at all? What did you think you were doing? And Jack says, well, he says, Lusmore got a reward and he only gave you Wednesday. I'm after giving you 2 days, and I demand that I get my reward as well. And because I've given you 2, I want 2 things. So the fairy folk say, well, what is it that you want? He goes, well, I want this hump gone off me back, and while you're at it, I'll take that big ruby over there. Well, they looked and he says, do you know what? We will give you something. And it's a lot bigger than that ruby. But you've been very mean, you've been very coarse. And when he clapped his hands, the wee folk descended on him, bundled him up. And the next thing he knew, he was being torn back up through the soil and pushed down the hill. And when he got to the bottom of the hill and he went to stand up, he found that he couldn't. For he didn't just have his own hump on his back at this stage, he had also been given Lusmore's as well. He became known as Jack of the 2 humps. And it took him days to make his way home. And when he did eventually get back there, it said that he never got out of his bed. He was more of a burden to his mother. And the story had spread about Lusmore, and equally the story spread about Jack Madden as well. And most people decided not to risk it and never go up to the hill at night. Now, we've been to that hill. We have been to the hill. This is the thing about these stories, is that they're set. You give people something real about it. And Tom, do you remember the first time we went up to that hill?
Yeah.
It was very dark. It was very late. Did we climb it that late at night?
No, it was too difficult to climb. But there was when we were there, Venus was up in the sky. It was that dark. The moon was on one side, Venus on the other, and Ita took out her tin whistle and played a tune. And we told the story at the bottom of the hill with the big hill in front of us, and the light in the sky. And it was you couldn't have picked a better time to be there.
But the reason I didn't climb the hill wasn't because it was too dark or too dangerous. I wasn't risking it. The second time we went back to that hill, it ended up with about 12 of us and a French lady up on the top of the hill, and we told the story and we sang songs in it. But I said that's a real story put in a real place that's tangible and approachable, and it can be held, you know. And I think it characterizes everyone in that story wants to be Lusmore. No one wants to be Jack Madden. No one wants to be the angry mother. But we can always think of someone in our lives who are like those people.
Nice.
Does anyone have any questions on that story or on anything around what we've spoken about so far? No, we're all good to go on then.
Just the name of the hill there. What was the name of the hill?
Knockgrafton.
Knockgrafton.
So knock as in, so I don't even know if you can hear that now. It's silly that I did that, but Knockgrafton, and it's in Tipperary.
Okay.
Just north
Crafton
of
Street.
Clare.
Knockgrafton, like Crafton Street in Dublin.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's an amazing site. I went up another hill recently, a similar Mott Bailey, which would have had a wooden structure on it, but it was nowhere near as impressive. I didn't have the feeling of Knockgrafton. It's when you can get out into the landscape and be in a place like that really kind of taps you into it. The right setting is perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. I think you're going to probably go on with the next story. Another story, is that right?
Yeah, well, this is it. Like, there's so many different types of stories. Like, we're never going to run out of stories and ways to tell them. But again, it's about looking how the people engage with each other. Now, that's that story said, like, of Luxmore, showed how, good communication, how we approach a situation was important. But the other thing is that not all Irish stories are as happy as that. And there's a beautiful story about an island off the coast of Kerry. And the island now is known as the Island of the Lonely Seals. The old name for it, in fact, the island itself, have been lost. But it was said that the people who lived on that island had a kind of harsh life. There was only maybe 4 families living on this island, and they lived off fishing. Which, I mean, as Irish people, we live on an island. That's natural for us. They lived off a little bit of fishing. The eggs of seabirds. They had a few goats, and they had a little bit of land for farming. But some of those islands are so rocky. There's barely a tree on them. But there was a beautiful patch of grass on that island, almost perfectly circular, lush green grass. But no one would farm it. No one would work it. No one would even walk across it, because it was said to be the summer residence of some of the fairy folk of Ireland. So these people were happy to kind of, ignore that bit of land and live just a fairly kind of harsh life. Now, there was one winter that was quite harsh for those people, and they really struggled. It was hard to get the boats out. There was huge storms. They couldn't make it to the mainland, which they would do regularly to pick up supplies. But the storms didn't fade away until in the February, and it was followed by an incredible drought. The heat was too much. The land became very dry and wasn't workable. And after a while, the people on the mainland realized that they hadn't seen anyone from the island for a while. So a bunch of them got together and went across on a boat. And when they got there, they were amazed by what they found. The smoke was coming out of chimneys. There were things lying around, but there were no people. And they couldn't have been gone too long because the ashes were still warm in the fire. But what really took them by surprise was this horrible screaming, this howling that was coming. And while Irish people are used to the idea of the wail of the banshee, this was something very different. It seemed to be all around them, and they made their way down along the shore, down to the caves, and they found a cave filled with sea lions who were just letting out this horrible moan. But there was something unnatural about it, that the people were missing. There were stories that they'd been stolen away by pirates, that they'd been lost into the sea. But what the people did was they got out of there fairly sharp. They went back to the mainland, and they got a priest. They brought a holy man back to the island with them. And when he arrived there, he started to kind of bless the land, and the wailing, the crying, the screaming. It stopped for a little while, but then it just started up again while he was still there. And as he explored the island and he went down and he saw the seals, he came across this patch of green grass, and he saw that there was a plough in the middle of it, that the ground had been torn up, and he knew what had gone wrong. The people, in their desperation during these storms, had tried to work the land and had disturbed the otherworld people. And the priest knew well enough to abandon all hope and left the island. I think the island was left empty for about 50, 60 years, and it wasn't until things got really bad in Ireland on the mainland, where landlords were becoming, tougher. They were kicking people out for no good reason. They were taking back their lands, and there was these few families, through pure desperation, decided to take up residence on the island again. They'd heard the stories, they knew it was there. And when they got over, the island had grown quite wild. There were still goats, amazingly, wild goats now. Descendants of the original ones were roaming the island, but the stone houses were falling down and were in disrepair. But these people decided to make the best of it. Weird thing was is they couldn't hear the cries anymore, and they assumed everything was just stories. And it was only that there was a young boy, one of the sons, his name was Patrick. He kept telling his parents about the crying. He could hear it worse at night, but they thought he was a bit odd. He wasn't like the other kids. He didn't, play sports. He kind of seemed to fall into books, any books he could get his hand on. He lived in a world of fantasy. So while he was complaining, the rest of the adults, they got to repairing the houses and making the place livable. And they just seemed to find the boy a bit of a nuisance because he wouldn't stop going on about it. And they'd been there a few weeks and they'd converted, 3 of the homes and made them habitable. And one night it got so much for young Patrick that he went into his parents' room in the middle of the night crying, and he said that he couldn't sleep. The wailing had gotten so bad that he felt he'd never sleep again. And his father dismissed him, but, pulled him into the bed between his parents and made him sleep there for the night. The next morning he got up and he wanted to go and investigate and follow the wailing and see where the noise was coming from. And he was told, he wasn't allowed to do that. They distracted him with work. He knew it was the noise. He had seen the seals down by the water, and the islanders had a very bad relationship with the seals because they were desperate. They were fishing. They had a bad relationship because the seals kept interfering with the nets. There was one young man actually who was like pulling in the nets, and a seal managed to bite through it, and he lost half his catch to the seals. And of course, the grown men on the island responded by making their way down to the beaches and killing some of the seals. And this broke young Patrick's heart. And when he managed to finally get away from the chores that his parents had given him, he made a plan to go and see where the seals were living. He wanted to go down, but his parents wouldn't let him out of their sight until the mother said, "Patrick, will you head down and get me some fresh mussels just off the rocks at the base of the cliff there if you make your way down to that?" And he knew this was his chance. He went down, he was pulling fresh mussels, a greeny grey colour, off the rocks into his little bucket, when all of a sudden he heard a voice coming from behind him. The only thing behind him was the sea. And he heard this voice and he turned around and he saw this beautiful woman in this blue-green tunic coming out of the water. And she called him by his name. And he knew that there was something special about her. And she said that she was one of the seal people. She told Patrick the story of what had happened, that when the original people on the island had disturbed the land, they'd been cursed and they'd been turned into seals, and that the wailing he heard and that all the people had heard wasn't from normal seals, natural seals. They were people. She said that her brother had been trying to get fish to feed them. They didn't have the skills of kind of natural seals, but he pulled up one of the fisherman's nets, but he'd lost 2-3 of her brothers to the fishermen, having killed them. And the woman said to Patrick that it was so important that he go and explain this. She wanted to broker peace between the two people. That they won't listen to me. I've tried. I'm one person. I'm a young boy. I'm not in a position to tell people what to do and to tell them to stop. So she says, listen, if you go to the house that's nearest the cliff edge, it's in a bad way, but if you bring your father there and just tell him to stand in the doorway and just to reach above the flat stone above the door, to reach in there, he'll believe you. Patrick left the woman. He went back to his father and he was explaining and he was telling the story. And weirdly, his father, of course, just thought the story was entertaining, but there was something different about Patrick that the father knew that he had to listen. The mother was just giving out, saying, "Where are the mussels?" He'd left the bucket down on the beach and she was having none of it. But his father thought, no, maybe there is something in this. He gathered a couple of his particularly skeptical friends and they were told a story, and the 3 men and the young boy made their way to the house at the edge of the cliff. And when the father went in and stood in the doorway, just like Patrick had told him, he reached up and he pulled out this little kind of sack purse, and in it there was a gold coin. And he knew that it was real, and he knew, listen to Patrick, exactly what he had to do. Straight away, even the skeptical men, they started repairing the grass. They removed the plough and the tools. They went to where there was other good land on it, the little bits that there were. They cut up the sod and they repaired it. And as soon as they finished, and it was late at night, they were working by firelight. They had it finished, they patted down the soil, and they looked at Patrick. He'd become a bit of a celebrity, you know. They actually listened to him and believed him. And he told them that the crying had stopped. Now, after that point, suddenly fishing was plentiful. The seals almost seemed to work the fish over towards the boats. The goats were domesticated. Things were going great. And the people lived on that island very happily for many years, until things on the mainland had become a bit easier. The landlords had lost a bit of their power, and suddenly the people knew it was time for them to return home. They gathered up their things. They made sure to leave it as they'd found it. They thanked the seals down on the beach and returned to the mainland. Patrick took that story back to the mainland with him, but every summer when he got older, he'd take a boat and he'd go back and he'd pick mussels on the beach and sit with the seals and then return back to his family on the mainland. And that's the story of the island of the lonely seals. It said, when I say that the island is, you know, the west coast of Ireland, and that the name has been lost, the island, it actually said that the island was reclaimed by the sea, that it fell below the waves, and it's still a visiting place of our otherworld people. Sorry. I love that story because, I mean, it's very easy to imagine yourself. We've all had a time where we wanted people to believe us and people to listen to us. And I think, as someone who like attended camps back in the day, I go and spend a week down in Cork, like to realize that you could find a way to speak where people would listen to you. If you found the right pair of ears, and if you get one person to listen, that would grow. And it was the same time when we opened the museum. Our audience was so small at the start, but the more you do it, like if it goes wrong, if you find it's hard and you don't get, if only one person listens and that's not enough for you, you go out and you tell the story again and again and again until you have the people that you want in front of you. I think that's really important when you're younger, to learn that, you know, you will get listened to. If you tell the right thing to the right person, your voice will be heard. Now, with that story, Tom.
Yeah.
I'm talking there like kind of about the importance, like kind of like finding your voice and you know, getting it to the right person. I didn't have the pressure you had when the museum opened. I was here, you know, obviously telling stories and doing my bits and pieces, but the struggle of getting people to the place when you're doing it, what's involved in that?
It's a question of belief, and do you think what you're doing is worthwhile? And that's what it comes down to. And I would say that long after we're gone, the stories will be retold, told and retold again. So when you do tell a story, you're never sure how it's going to land. And people may go away without telling you how much they enjoyed it, but they'll repeat it over in their heads, and they will tell other people. So it might come back to you. We've seen people come back to the museum 5, 6. Who were the people who were in the other day? They were there. He was there.
He was there with his girlfriend in their 20s, and he confessed to me that the last time he'd been in the museum was for his confirmation, which was 10 years ago. He was in the museum beginning of summer 2011. I felt so old when he said that, but he came back, coming in as a family and then coming back on a date are two very different things.
And this is coming in as a child and then returning as an adult. And those kind of things, they're long cycle things. So when you do these, when you tell these stories and they have meaning for people, and they catch people in a particular way, and they'll catch them at points in their life where, you know, there is pressure on them or they're feeling a particular way, and those stories will nourish them, nourish them emotionally, psychologically, and provide them with roots to think about how they're feeling. That's what's important. And the reason we started the museum in the first place was we felt there was something really important about oral storytelling, and there was something magical in the way that people talked about things. And when you introduce these characters that are you know, the impossible, you're able to discuss impossible things. You're able to discuss things in general terms that people relate to. And it's the reason that I guess fairy stories or certain stories are so powerful, because it allows people to explore feelings at one remove. It allows them to explore power structures and ways of communicating. And every story has a different nuance in it, and people will take different things out of different stories.
I think as well
just to say on the seal story, all of the Keneallys, that's a surname in Ireland. All the Keneallys are descended from seals.
Yeah.
And so we're bound into these stories that all the O'Mahanys are descended from bears. So we do have this connection into these story tropes, and they do lean in to our experiences. And the reason they're retold is because they do continue to have meaning for people.
Yeah, I think as well, when you can hear a story as a child and hear the exact same story 10 years later as an adult, and what you take from it can change based on what your experience has. Suddenly you start feeling, someone said something to me recently where they said if they watched their favorite movies as a child, they feel like they probably sympathize with the villains a bit more. It becomes an awful lot more, we become an awful lot mature in how we look at people, and there's a lot more empathy and sympathy that we can allow. I know some of the stories I hear, I can understand the motivation of the person who's considered the bad guy in the story. And when you know more about their past, you realize that they're a product of their own experience, and had things been different. Like Tom, you have that thing of like, what if? And when you decide to change something in a story, or someone asks you, well, what if?
It's a technique developed by a guy called Jack Sipes, and he explores storytelling, and he offers up a standard story that we've heard before, and then he would probably give you the original version of the story that is different than the one we've heard. So, for example, the one he uses most commonly would be Little Red Riding Hood, and where the woodcutter comes to rescue Little Red Riding Hood. But in the original story, there's no woodcutter coming. There's no patriarchy that's going to fix everything. And then he begins to explore with the listeners, what if? What if the wolf was a vegetarian? What if? And then the people who have heard the story begin to offer up their own what ifs. What if this happened? What if that happened? And so they unpick the story for themselves. And what happens then is they unpick it in a way that's meaningful to them. And they find extra meanings within the story. And then people are able to build off that. So you suddenly begin to explore with one group what's happening in their lives, and it begins to fill in things, and it gets people to explore. On the storytelling courses that he runs, it's over a 3-month period, and gets kids to build their own stories over a period of time. It's a project called the Bridges Project that he runs right across the northwest of America. Just to come back on what some of you were saying there, Mark, about movies, they're all, and books and movies are all very good. I have this book here, which is I don't know if you see that, story listening and experience in early childhood, and this is fMRI studies of children listening to stories, and it shows there is more brain activity in children listening to oral storytelling. This is oral storytelling without reading from a book. So where you're hearing a story directly from the person, there is more brain activity than in any other form. So movies, iPads, whatever else, TV, there is more brain activity when you're being told a story directly to you from another person. And this is particularly with children, and it's a precursor to critical literacy and language acquisition. So I don't know what age group this group is dealing with, but it is very key significant. And one of the things we always say here, that I'm most happy when people will go home and tell the kids bedtime stories at nighttime. That is the success factor for us. When people experience that and are able to do that, and you can see the imagination sparring up. And it's critically clear to us here when people come into the museum, children who have had that experience of oral storytelling and children who haven't. It's a passive and active listening experience, and it is clear as day. it's really significant, the difference, and it's really easy to tell. Sorry.
It's a thing as well of someone giving you their time is so important, and it's that, and it's to allow, a good storytelling will allow for conversation. The listener can impact the story with just a gesture, how they're leaning in, like you might move through one part of the story a little bit quicker, or focus a little bit more on something when you see people reacting to it. And it's being able to have eyes on the audience there as well that makes it important. But I think as someone who's been on both sides of it, as a storyteller and as a teenager who would go down to Cork and sit and listen to a storyteller, it was just to have that time was unreal for someone to actually share their experience. And it wasn't even necessarily just the stories they were telling, it was the preamble and the conversation around it. That was amazing. And then I felt that I could join in if I wanted to, but equally I could be a passive listener and I could just enjoy the experience that was going on around me. Because it does become like you try to replicate things with surround sound, but we are in part of a group and it's happening. It's literally all around you.
One of the other things we notice about storytelling is that often time passes much more quickly when we're involved in storytelling. And you'll notice people coming through the museum, they will suddenly, the time will go by in an instant. It will just flash by. So it does create that moment of flow where people are completely enmeshed in the story and they lose the other problems they have around, and they completely get imbued with the story.
And the experience is so subjective. What someone gets out of a story is the same as, if you go and look at art, if you go to a gallery and you look at something, you can appreciate it. You might just simply like the color or like the shape of something, or particularly with some stuff that isn't like kind of figurative or anything like that, you get what you want out of it. Or if you see a situation and you don't know the story behind it, but you can create something in your head, it can be just as valid as the original intention of the artist, and that's why we love playing with the stories. And Irish stories are recognizable around the world because every culture will have a different version of it. It's very easy to tweak it and recognize it, but we also have the scope to then go and look at stories from other cultures and adapt them ourselves. I think Tom, we have another story for the guys. You're gonna tell us a story.
Just a moment there, guys, because it's really, really interesting. But can I just ask one question there, just to give a moment? Because I think a lot of you work with young people, isn't it, as well? And I'd also be just curious, do you have your own native stories there that you could be using with your young people?
Well, I mean, when you look at what the Brothers Grimm did, you can look at kind of where those stories came from. They didn't just make them up; they're much older stories,
Exactly.
So we're a member of an organization called FESC, Federation of European Storytellers.
Okay.
And they have storytellers from every country in Europe. So every culture has a culture of storytelling. It may not be something you're familiar with, but it is there, and there are people out there who have stories they can share with you. This, for me, also, just to say, storytelling is a creative act, and it's the lowest barrier to entry. Everybody can get involved in a story at different levels, and it's the least cost creativity. There's no barrier to entry. It's easy to do. You don't need materials. You just need people. And so I think it's if anybody wants to know, I mean, Iceland is awash with stories. We know this. But every culture is, and I just don't know where everybody is from around. But if anybody wants a connection to their storytelling organizations or wants some help finding some stories, then we're more than happy to help.
Oh, that would be wonderful. So
no problem at all.
Okay, so they can connect with you directly.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, you want to put it in the chat or do something afterwards, then that's fine. We can put some links on there and they can get in contact with us. More than happy to help.
Okay. And then
there are people out there who are very experienced in working with young people and telling stories in a variety of circumstances. So whether that's people with, we know there's a number of people who are working with migrants, with sex workers, youth workers, disadvantaged people, travelers, different communities. and working on different social aspects. So we're quite happy to put you in contact with those people, and they'll give you tools to go and advance your storytelling capabilities.
That sounds really, really cool. Yeah, there's also Miruna there who'd like to ask a question. Sorry, but it's nice to have that conversation now.
Yes, hello, and thank you for the presentation so far and for the stories, of course. I wanted to ask something that maybe is a bit connected to what you are doing, but maybe not totally. And I wanted to ask if and how you would use stories to promote things. My question comes from, let's say, my experience working in a communication department trying to promote Erasmus+, which is a European program. I'm sure you're familiar with it. So how would you recommend using storytelling in order to promote the program rather than just promoting it in a, I don't know, more familiar way via other types of activities?
So the key things are, in our point of view, 93% of every communication is a personal recommendation. It's word of mouth, and it is this. So that is so. One of the things we're interested in the museum is a thing called narrative takeout. What is the thing that someone's, after you've spoken to them or finished your conversation, what is the thing they go to tell somebody? Do they tell them anything? So understanding that will lead you into saying what kind of stories might work. Is that okay? So understanding what they're thinking. So it's not what you're saying, it's what they're hearing. And then the next thing is, when you give them something, what you want to give them is something they want to tell somebody else. So you're giving them something they want to tell somebody else, because it's going to make them feel good about telling the other person. I have something to share with somebody else. This is why the story you tell is more important than the storyteller. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next thing is you find out what's working. And then the story isn't about you. The story isn't about you. It's about what you can do for the other person. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. So it's about them. It's always about them. And when they're telling the story, it's about them giving something to somebody else. So we share a story. Okay? So then it can't be about Erasmus Plus, because Erasmus Plus it's not like a furry kitten. It's not, I can't do anything with it. So we need to make the story about something else, and Erasmus Plus is a feature of the story that is drawn in and is embodied in the story. Okay? This is not an easy process. Creating stories is not an easy thing. Okay? But you can make it feel included. Okay? So finding the right kind of story, like if it's someone overcoming a difficulty that person can relate to, then that becomes important for them. And they'll want to share that with somebody else. One of the things we do in the museum is leave the last link open. Like when Mark says about the plough being removed from the fairy field on the island, this is important because we know the plough is made of iron, and fairies do not like iron. And when we tell the stories, we tell people about the fairies not like iron, and then we tell the story about the plough in the field, and they go, oh, everybody goes, well, that was important because the plough is made out of iron. So they close the loop on that, and it makes them feel smart. Okay? And if you can make someone feel smarter than you, that makes them want to share that with other people. Okay? So they're little tools we can use, but you need to find the right story for the right situation and for the right audience. Is that okay? And they're just some pointers, Maruna. You'll know your audience better than me, and you'll know what's working. But if you can understand what people are hearing, then you'll know what's going to work. And I guess one of the things you'll know is what's not working. And by process of failing 100 times, you'll succeed.
Thank you.
If I was to add one small bit to that, just to identify the stories within the Erasmus Plus experience, speak to the people who've been through it, but don't look for those sideline stories that they have that experiences they had while going through the experience. Because if you want people to start and do it, you need to talk to people who've already been there and identified their stories. Okay, because you're selling a potential experience, and having the outskirts, the things that they did unrelated to it, but during the time of it, can be really helpful and really important. But speak to the people who've been through it.
The old phrase is 2 ears, 1 mouth.